This video corresponds to the graphics labs that you can do after this. So we covered a variety of descriptive statistics like the mean, standard deviation and so on, as well as some inferential statistics like confidence intervals or standard errors that you would typically put into graphs. So we have all the tools now to go ahead and try all this out. And before you start with the labs, I do want to go through the types of graphs that we have at our disposal and for what purpose each should be used. There's a few things that you keep an eye on, things you might want to avoid. Do not confuse your audience. And certain graphs are also better for certain data types than others, so I'll mention all these things. So which graphs for which purpose? As a number one, I put here visualizing distributions. We already covered this in the exploratory graphics, but even for final data presentations, you may actually want to talk about your distributions. Distributions may be important results, how they look like. So don't hesitate to use those exploratory or diagnostics graphs in final reports or publications or theses. These are highly informative. They also show effect sizes, obviously. Histograms tend to be more detailed versions of the exact shape, so it's slightly easier to visualize. Box plots are more compact. They convey the same type of information. So this first trait here could be this box plot, but it's much more compact. I can put a bunch of others for other classes in the same graph. Our second objective may be visualizing relationships among variables. So we have scatter plots for this, and as I mentioned before, your predictor should always be the X, your response should be the Y. So this may be climate, this may be growth. And you never connect those individual dots if you talk about just a relationship, a correlation between two variables. So you fit a line or a curve. We'll cover later how this works. But that's the principle of scatter plots. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Line plots can actually do exactly the same thing. So except that instead of putting one variable over another, I'm putting both as lines over a time axis. So in order for line plots to make any sense, you need time or some sort of ordered sequence like developmental stages or usually something that has to do with time. And one of the advantages of line plots is that you can see lags between variables. That happens quite often, that something happens in variable 1, let's say climate, and then something happens in variable 2 just a little bit later. So it's always a little bit offset. So something happens here and you get a response observed a little later. That's quite common, and that screws up your correlations, right? So you don't see this in scatter plots. That's where line plots are really revealing, because the eye can see that there are common patterns and that they're just offset a little bit. So if you have a time component in your data, in your graph, by all means, go for the line plots. Those tend to be more informative than the scatter plots, even if you just want to look at the relationship among variables. So the next big set of graphs covers the objective of comparing treatments, locations, different types. So you want to compare classes, class variables. And again, you can use the box plot, a bar chart. So these sort of convey the same information. In this case, you usually report the mean and the standard deviation. Here, the equivalent would be percentiles and quartiles. If you have normally distributed data, you can use this. If not, definitely use the box plot. So you should not use the bar chart to convey any kind of information about your data if it's non-normally distributed. This would be misleading. We'll cover this just a little bit further down in a second. If you have normally distributed data, you can still use box plots. So these are still great. They convey everything you want, including outliers, which you don't usually have in bar charts. Now, a more compact version are dot plots. Those are actually not covered in the core curriculum in this course, but the Graphics Lab 5C actually shows you how to do this. So one of the reasons why the dot plots are useful is that you can put multiple dots on those lines. So you can pack a lot of information into those graphs. If you have complex factorial experiments with lots of treatments and lots of treatment levels, then the dot plots can convey this very concisely. But it's not such a common graph, so bar charts are more common. You can also show multiple treatment levels here by grouping your graphs. You would have a white one and a red one next to each other to convey two different locations. But these are actually preferred in terms of visual accuracy and conveying effects, because it's very easy to make comparisons this way and this way and this way and this way and that way. So these are highly valued graphical tools. They're a bit more complicated to generate. That's why I don't necessarily cover them in this class. And last but not least, you can also use line plots for treatment effects if you have ordered treatment levels. So if you have something like a 1-time, 2-time, 4-time fertilizer, you could put them like this with a standard arrow and connect them to show that they belong to each other. And you may have another line for another location or for another factorial treatment. So this is also allowed. That would be fine. Now, all of these, except for the bar chart, can start with units that best fit your purpose. But this one here must start at 0, because otherwise it's visually confusing what they actually convey. So it can be highly misleading if you basically just show the top of your bar charts with a big effect. So people, if they see a bar chart, they would assume that the bottom here is 0. That's just a convention. And since everybody is used to this, you have to conform to this. So you can't just cut off the top of the bar charts that would go all the way down. So in that case, use dot plots or box plots also do the job just fine. These don't have to start at a 0 scale. And obviously, if you have interval scale variables, don't use bar charts at all. So that would be just wrong. So you would never see temperature displayed as a bar chart or something like that. So precipitation actually gets displayed as a bar chart quite often, because you do have that 0 value, and 0 precipitation means something. So in order to convey that magnitude, this is actually a good choice for something like a ratio scale variable with a 0 value that really means something important. So that's where I would use bar charts. And last but not least, I should tell you to avoid pie charts. Pie charts are generally not accepted in science because they are visually misleading. For some reason, we are really bad at estimating the area of a circle, and people take advantage of this, right? And you can even exaggerate this with 3D. So those 48 here, 48%, they almost look the same as the 32%, right? So if you look at this, wow, that's taxes are as much as crude costs. That's crazy. But if you look at it in a bar chart, it's much easier to assess the sizes of the different classes accurately. So these are generally not accepted in science. And let's also talk about what kind of summary statistics to use in your graph. So you have the choice of means and medians, and it depends a little bit on how your distributions look like. So I mentioned this before. For normal distributions, averages are just fine, but for highly skewed distributions, percentiles are really the way to go. So percentiles, quartiles, quantiles. And to just give you an example out of the real world, how much of a difference this can make and how misleading a statistic can be if you get the wrong one. I pulled some data from Statistics Canada. That's median income, average income per individual who filed a tax return in Canada, so in 2019. So the median is 36,000 approximately. So half the population earns less than that or reports less than that in income for tax purposes, and half the population earns more. And 36, well, if you're in Alberta, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, and that is what it is. Now, if you report the average, that's out here, so somewhere at 50,000, and that's interesting. And the reason why is that this is a highly skewed distribution. So if you look at the top 1% of earners, so those earn on average about 300,000. So that would sit even beyond this page here. And 1% of the population is actually not an insignificant number, right? So this is these are 270,000 people roughly, or taxpayers. If I look at the 1% of taxpayers, then the top 0.1%, they earn 1 million. So they are basically three screens 3 computer screens, if you look at this full screens toward the right. So they on average earn $1 million. And that is still 27,000 people. So they have considerable pulling power in moving that average over. And then if I look at the top 0.01%, they earn 5 million on average. That's still a substantial number, and they are out there, probably if you're sitting in a room, it would be out there in the next room relative to your monitor. And so those have substantial pulling power to move your average here to the side. And then obviously there is also much richer people than this. Those sit, across the street somewhere, and they pull that distribution, or they pull that average over. So that makes this average go into the order of 50,000. So if you would say, the average salary of a Canadian is 50,000, well, that's pretty good. If you have a typical family of 2 income earners, they earn 100,000. That's a pretty rich country, but it's actually not quite as good as that. So this would be a misleading statistic. So if you do have highly skewed distributions, do use box plots to report the medians and outliers. So median, percentiles, quartiles are great for non-normal distribution. Mean, standard deviation, variances are fine for normal distributions. Actually, normal distributions can use any of those statistics and graph types. And standard errors and confidence intervals, they actually kind of sit in between, because you don't really have to worry about normality here that much, because we've seen in the previous videos, they are, even if your original data is non-normally distributed, the standard errors or confidence intervals of the means or medians, they are actually normally distributed. So you could indicate them by these symmetrical bars without being misleading. The problem is that you would still normally match a standard error with a mean. That's how most graphical packages are set up, and the mean is misleading if you have non-normal distributions. So keep that in mind. There's really no reason why you shouldn't use box plots rather than bar charts when in doubt. And so the last thing to mention is the choice of whether to use standard errors or confidence intervals versus standard deviations. That's also clear now, right? So if you're talking about your data, if you want to describe your data, which you really want to do in many cases, something like wood quality is much more variable in this ecoregion than another. Like if you're working for a commercial forestry operation, they are after uniform wood properties. So if you can't get uniform wood properties for a pulp mill, then you're in trouble. So the nature of your original variables are very often important, and so you can only convey that with standard deviations. Standard errors tell you nothing about the nature of your variation in your original data. So this mostly reflects a sample size. Now, if you want to make a point that this one is better than that, and you calculated means, and you want to convey how confident you are in the means, then clearly the standard errors and confidence intervals are the choice. The standard deviations, in contrast, really tell you nothing about the confidence, because you can have a lot of variation within 2 regions, and yet you can, with a large enough sample size, you can get very, very precise estimates of the averages of traits that are relevant. So I think that's what you need to know about descriptive statistics, about the inferential statistics that we covered so far, and about graphics. And I can let you loose on the labs now. So those are the shortcuts to the graphic labs. 5A, you probably have started that already. 5B, there's an opportunity to apply the standard error and confidence interval calculations that we covered in the previous videos. And then if you want and you have time, you can also do the lab 5C here. That's an optional lab. That's a little bit more advanced and complicated. To recover, for example, things like dot plots and other information-packed graph types. I do want to give you a sense what's in that lab and why this is a good idea to do it if you have the time. So I give you an example here out of that lab for a high data to ink ratio plot. So what that means is that you have a lot of information that's crammed into one graph, and that's an art that's appreciated by scientists. I can demonstrate to you how effective this is. So I can tell a story about my experiment around this graph. So I can say that I studied volume versus density of trees. So my general result here is that the faster the growth, the bigger the trees, the lower the density. And that relationship is actually observed across 3 different ecosystems. So we go here from a montane one with very high densities, mid-elevation to a low-elevation ecosystem. So this holds true across different ecosystems. It also doesn't seem to matter which species I look at. So this trend does look the same for the circles here, which represents one species, and the squares, which represent another. And this also seems to be age class independent. So even different age classes, which are represented here as a size of the symbol, don't break that correlation. So a very strong and pronounced result that I found here. Okay, so if you present something like this in a PowerPoint presentation or in a paper, that is very effective communication. I could probably show you 8 or 10 graphs that show all these elements separately. So I could have different graphs for different ecosystems or for different species. I could have all kinds of other relationships. So I could look at density over age, and density over volume, and volume over age in different ecosystems. So if you have a presentation like this, you flip through one graph after another, and the audience just keels over, right? Because they can't adjust, they can't take that in so quickly. So there are just too many things that are disconnected and that you can't keep in your head at the same time. But if you have it all in one graph, and you use symbols, colors, and even lines or functions to add additional information, that is really the art of presentation of quantitative data. So if you do your projects, I encourage you to think about it, how you can do this. So we'll help you figure this out. But these are a little bit harder to generate, so it's an optional lab.